You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Our opening prayer is from the Book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Welcome and greetings. This talk is going to be about the Book of Proverbs. And actually, this book is a great start into the Old Testament, especially for a discussion group, Bible study group, or anything like that. There's no detailed background information that is needed by the participants. There's no dates to have to follow, or battles, or long lists of names or anything. And it can also be a great way to elicit participation by those who are in the Bible study group. So it's a good start if you're looking for something to sort of get you into the Old Testament and you're a little bit wary of all the other narrative books and all the complications of going through the prophets or that, to the background that has to be there to find out what the context is and everything. The wisdom literature, of which the Book of Proverbs is a part, can be a very, very good way to be able to start doing that. Now, before we even start into the Book of Proverbs here, I would strongly recommend that you listen to my talk on the wisdom literature in general, because I give some basic concepts there that I will refer to as I go through the Book of Proverbs here, and just in general will help you to understand the wisdom literature. And again, the Book of Proverbs is a part of the wisdom literature. So that is available in this series on the internet. It's called Wisdom, A Different Way of Looking at Life, and it will give you a great background. I will make specific references back to it, and I won't repeat a lot of the things that are in that talk as I go through Proverbs. So I very much recommend that to you before you even start this particular series of the lectures. Now, the Book of Proverbs itself is an anthology of sorts, different parts to it, different collections of sayings. There's chapter 1, verse 1, the very beginning of the book, through chapter 9, verse 18. Then in chapter 10, verse 1, another collection starts, and it runs to chapter 22, verse 16. And yet another collection of sayings starts in chapter 22, verse 17, middle of the chapter, and runs through chapter 24, verse 34. And then we have some additions onto that we'll see as we go through it for this. Now, the Proverbs go back all the way to the time of Solomon, and even actually before the time of Solomon. The title of the book itself, from the very beginning, chapter 1, verse 1, goes, The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And some are actually from him, but not all of them. In saying that they are of Solomon, though, there's no deception in that, in making the entire book and all of the Proverbs his, because as they understood it in those times, the idea of authorship, or the idea of attributing something to someone, could be very flexible and elastic. They could actually be from that person. So yes, some of these probably do date back to Solomon himself. And it's difficult to be able to determine just which ones. They could also be from other authors, but written in honor of Solomon. Remember, Solomon is known for his wisdom. And so they could be in honor of him, or they could be modeled on him or in imitation of him, since he did write some of the Proverbs. So all these are possibilities, and they get collected into this book, this collection, of a couple different collections, and there are two appendices to it in chapter 31 and chapter 30. Chapter 30 introduces us to someone called Agur, and we don't know who he was, and chapter 31, Lemuel, and we know little, if anything, about him either. And then finally, it closes with a beautiful poem that I'll look at with you and when we get to it. So it's an anthology of sorts. It's made up of a number of different things. The final redaction, or the final editing of the book, is done in about the 4th or 5th century BC. And remember, Solomon dies in 922 BC. So there's quite a span there. And really, as I mentioned in the previous lecture about wisdom in general, some of these proverbs, these sayings, are timeless in the sense that we don't even know where they came from or when. They come out of folklore from the ages. But the writing down of these in the collections that are part of the Book of Proverbs, the writing down, redacting, the final product, if you will, as we have it, is about the 4th or 5th century BC. Now, there are different theories about how the book is structured, how these collections are put together, knit together, but it's very hard to explain without some kind of visual aids. Of course, we're working just with audio here, so we're going to have to leave that go by. You may find some notes in your Bible that might say something about the structure. You might have read something about it or that. But we're just going to take a look at the book in general and go through it. And again, we can't go through it line by line or anything like that. So it's a general overview. So, called the Book of Proverbs. So what's a proverb? Any proverb. Well, it's a saying, a very brief one usually. It can be a teaching. It can be a command. It can be a teaching, a saying to do something. Or it could be just to counsel something, to give some advice, not having all the force of a command. They're very brief. They're full of common sense. And sometimes you might say they have a certain pithiness to them. The Hebrew word in the Old Testament for a proverb is mashal, M-A-S-H-A-L. And that word in Hebrew can mean either a rule or a likeness. So a rule in the sense of what something is or should be. A likeness, something that's compared to something else, and there's a similarity, or to the opposite, a contrast. So a proverb could be either of those, this saying, this command, or this counsel that will say what something is or should be, like a rule to describe something, or it may show a likeness, that something is like something or not like something. It's a general way of talking about a proverb. It was simply put by one person that a proverb is the wisdom of many and the wit of one. Or another person put it, it's a saying or something that has shortness, sense, and some salt to it. There are all different kinds of forms of proverbs in the Book of Proverbs itself. There are these comparisons. Something is like something else. Something is not like something else. Sometimes they are very clear in these comparisons. But sometimes, too, they are open-ended. And they sort of make us think for a moment. They make us ponder. They stop us. And they just simply put something out there and say, in a sense, think about this. What do you think? They give advice. They give analogies. They give cause and effect. They help us to draw our own conclusions. Sometimes they are in the form of what's called better sayings. The proverb will say, this is better than that. And they sometimes take the form of what scholars call X plus 1. And I'll point those out, those forms, as we go along. But the X plus 1, X stands for any kind of number, and then plus 1 more. And so 3 plus 1, 4 things. 4 plus 1, 5 things. And I'll show how that works when we get to some examples of it. There are many observations on the human scene that are part of the Proverbs, and the Proverbs contain both commands and counsel. The law, the Torah, gives the commands. Think of the 10 Commandments. Do this, don't do that. Wisdom literature will give commands as well, but the wisdom literature, the wisdom writers will also give counsels. They'll tell why the commands are reasonable, why you should keep the commandments, why you should do certain things. They will give consequences as a reason why you should obey. And so the two things, a command and a counsel, go together very well. An example, for instance, is in chapter 23. This is from chapter 23, verses 20 and 21. I'm using the New American Bible, the Revised Edition, because this is the closest to what you might hear in the liturgy at Mass and lectionary. It's not quite exactly the same, and so it's probably the most familiar sounding. And, of course, there are many, many editions of it in the sense of publishers that put out the New American Bible. And it's also available on the Internet from the Conference of Catholic Bishops, for instance. And so it should be the most familiar to you. Now, back then to chapter 23, verses 20 and 21. And we read, "Do not join with wine-bibbers, nor with those who glut themselves on meat. For drunkards and gluttons come to poverty, and lazing about clothes one in rags." So the command not to do something, and then the reason why, because of what the consequences are. So don't join with wine-bibbers, wine drinkers, those who glut themselves on meat. Don't do that. There's the command. Why should you not do that? Because drunkards and gluttons come to poverty, and lazing about clothes one in rags. So being lazy. Okay, clothes one. The verb clothes one causes one to come to be clothed in rags. All right, for that. So the command in verse 20, the counsel in verse 21. Some of these are synonymous, saying what something is. Some are antithetical, saying what something is not. And the comparisons are like this. Some things are similar, some things are dissimilar. Same is true in the counsels. Also, too, the Proverbs will say what is right and what is wrong. But it's not always so clear. And sometimes the contrast is not there. Sometimes the choice is not between what is good and what is evil. Oftentimes it is, but not always. So sometimes the choice is between what is good and what is better. And Proverbs will do this oftentimes. And sometimes it'll just leave it open-ended and leave it up to the reader of what they think and what they should do. And so it might be that the writer will pose something, and he's in a sense saying, do you think so? Is it so? What do you think? This makes it great for a Bible study or a Bible discussion group, because you may have differences of opinion, different applications of these proverbs based on one's own life experiences. So there's a lot of room here for discussion and participation by the people who are part of the discussion group. One might be better for you than another. And all these are possibilities there. Now, to go through the book itself then, with that little bit of introduction, and again, strongly suggesting that you look at, or listen to the previous lecture about wisdom literature in general, that will give the basic principles. And remember that Proverbs is part of wisdom literature, so those basic principles are applicable to this book itself. I'd also suggest that you use your Bible. Follow along as you listen to this lecture, and pause it where you need to, so that you can think, you can look it over, you can go back if you need to. I won't read all of the verses. I'll just simply take some representative examples. I'll take a few that need some explanation, but they're really basically just to give you a flavor of what's in the book, and just read it yourself. And if you are using it in a group, just go through it slowly, as you would want to. It starts out, again, with almost like a title for the whole book itself. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So the connection to Solomon, the Proverbs of Solomon. But again, that does not mean he wrote all of them himself. They may be done in his honor, in his memory, or in his style. Some do come from him, but not all of them. And then in verses 2 through 7 of the first chapter, we have the purpose of the book. And really, in a sense, the purpose of all the wisdom books in the Bible. So let's look at this a little more closely. What are some of the purposes or the goals? Starting with verse 2, that people may know wisdom and discipline, may understand intelligent sayings, may receive instruction in wise conduct, in what is right, just, and fair, that resourcefulness may be imparted to the naive, knowledge and discretion to the young. The wise, by hearing them, will advance in learning. The intelligent will gain sound guidance. To comprehend proverb and byword, the words of the wise and their riddles. So, a number of things in there, on a number of different levels, and for different groups of people. Wisdom and discipline. It's not just for knowledge itself, for factual things, knowledge for its own sake, but it's for discipline. It's for action. It's for behavior. As I mentioned in the previous talk, it's one of the goals of wisdom, right action. And so, for this, the people may know wisdom and know discipline, not only to know it, but what to do with it in that sense. It is very practical. Wisdom leads to right action, or it's not useful. And wisdom also helps to understand the Proverbs themselves. So it isn't just a matter of stating them or memorizing them and restating them, but what do they mean? How are they applied? How do you make them a part of your life? You can have a lot of knowledge of facts, but what do these facts lead to? What do they do for you? Wisdom goes beyond just factual knowledge. And so verse 3 stresses that. The goal is right behavior. And not only what is right, but what is just and what is fair. Again, not everything is a choice between good and bad, good and evil. It might be good and better. So choices are there. And how do you make those choices? What guides you? It's not just the bare minimum of the law and the commandments. It goes a little further. And sometimes you have to make a choice that isn't covered by a particular law. And so what do you do then? In verse 4, wisdom will help to educate those who know little, so the young and the naive. The idea of discretion, how to weigh matters, how to judge affairs, a maturity. And wisdom is even for those who have that maturity and that discernment and that judgment. It will help them to do better. There's a need to interpret the sayings and to apply them properly and to teach others. Now it speaks also too about the riddles. There are not many riddles in the Bible. Other cultures did have riddles and used them much more often to teach and also as a way to remember a principle or some moral. The Bible doesn't do that as much as other cultures do. It is useful, this book of wisdom in the Proverbs, to help train the young and the unknowing. It helps those who are already mature to increase their knowledge and to do better, and to pass it on to others. So wisdom is trying to take you above and beyond just the bare minimum of the law. And you'll see that as you read on in the book itself. Now we have here too then, in verse 7, fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, or the beginning of wisdom. And this will repeat. It's like a refrain over and over. It'll be in different various ways. There'll be changes to it, but the same basic idea, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, what I used for our opening prayer. Variations on this theme. That's also an end or a goal of wisdom as well, to come to the fear of the Lord. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the fear is not the idea of terror. It's not being afraid of God. The fear of the Lord is the idea of awe, A-W-E, to be in awe of God when you realize who He is and what He has done. And so it's a reverential respect. It's fear in that sense, not a being scared of God, that He's out to get you or anything like that. So the fear of the Lord. And that comes with knowledge. The more you know about God, His greatness, His majesty, and His goodness, the more should be your awe and your reverence in your worship for Him. Realization of who God is and our place before Him. For that. Then we have in verse 8, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and reject not your mother's teaching." This is an idea of oftentimes what schooling was. It was from the parents to the children. And especially in the wisdom literature, this was used for diplomats and for those who would become rulers as well. And so it's how to become a good ruler over people and how to be a good diplomat, especially if you were working in a country as an ambassador, for instance, and they didn't have the same laws or the same code of laws that you were familiar with. And so how would you get along? How could you have a meeting ground so that you could be able to function and to be able to interact with these other cultures and other nations? The whole idea of diplomacy. And so the wisdom literature, and you'll see it as you read through the Book of Proverbs, and I'll point out one or two as we come across them. There's the idea of how you act with others that perhaps are of a different culture or different outlook from your own for this. And so it will be, for instance, a father to a son, or the king to his son, the prince who's going to succeed him someday. And mothers are also a part of this, and daughters as well. It's the general way of teaching. Now, there were other groups that would teach other subjects, such as they were at those times, but it's the kind of basic practical education that would be done in the family. Parents handing it on to their children for this. Now, so it starts out then in verse 10 with its advice. "My son, should sinners entice you, do not go if they say, 'Come along with us.'" And the idea of the counsel and the command to the children, to the son here, not to go along in bad company. And so we see this, and it's very practical. The father might be saying this to the son for his career in diplomacy, or his career that will be when he succeeds him as the king, but it could also be for any father for his children, son or daughter, and how to stay out of trouble. But more than that, how to prosper. Remember that one of the goals for wisdom is a certain amount of material prosperity. It's not bad in the eyes of the wisdom writers. Now, it has to be controlled, it has to be moderated, it has to be for the good of others as well. It's not just profit for the sake of itself. I talked a little bit about this, the wisdom and wealth interrelationship in the previous talk for that. So the instruction starts. In verse 11, interestingly, we get something we don't see too often in the Bible, somewhat rare, that the other side, if you will, gets to speak. The wicked, they get to speak. And so we find it in verse 11 with that. Don't go after them. Come with us. Let us lie in wait for blood. In other words, the wicked saying, let's get somebody, or something like that. You don't find that often, the other side speaking, but it happens here in the wisdom literature. And of course the father is saying, don't listen to them. This is what they're going to tell you. Don't be swayed by it. In verse 20, we have the personification of wisdom. Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the open squares, she raises her voice. Okay. How long, you naive ones, will you love naivete? How long will you turn away from my reproof? The arrogant delight in their arrogance, and fools hate knowledge. I will pour out to you my spirit. I will acquaint you with my words. Because I called and you refused, extended my hand and no one took notice, because you disdained all my counsel, my reproof you ignored, I in my turn will laugh at your doom, will mock when terror overtakes you. When terror comes upon you like a storm, and your doom approaches like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish befall you, then they will call me, but I will not answer. They will seek me, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge, and the fear of the Lord they did not choose. They ignored my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. Well then, they shall eat the fruit of their own way, with their own devices be glutted. For the straying of the naive kills them. The smugness of fools destroys them. But whoever obeys me dwells in security, in peace, without fear of harm. So we have the personification of wisdom here. She is the one who's speaking these words. It's not the father here to his children, but it's the wisdom herself. And I talked a little bit about the personification of wisdom in the other talk. They're strong words. They're almost vengeful here in the Bible. But yet, remember, the prophets also spoke out very, very strongly on issues of the day. And it was done to show the seriousness of the matters at hand. And that's why, for instance, in the narrative, you have those passages where the sacred writer says that God is angry. It's the idea of trying to force home on the person the importance and the seriousness of the matter. And that's how they did it. So it wasn't something, well, who cares, indifferent. It's not that at all. These things matter. There are consequences for one's behavior. And to drive the point home, it becomes very, very strong in the language. So if you've read anything of the prophets, you're familiar with this. Well, wisdom does it as well. Here it is wisdom herself who is doing it. And so the strong images and the strong language for this. To laugh at your doom. Okay. It seems so unchristian to us. But yet consider the context. You're centuries before the time of Christ. And it was meant to shake people up for that. So you have to cut them a little slack, I suppose you could say in some ways. There's a couple of other places where I'm going to mention that as well. You have to consider the context of centuries before Christ himself, before the Christian message for this. So this first chapter introduces us to some of the themes, not only of the book itself, but you could say of wisdom in general. And then we see in chapter 2 where, again, the father and mother are addressing this to their son. My son, this would be the father probably, my son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands. Okay, for that. Or it could be wisdom herself saying that to the young man for that. Now, opposite of the wicked, the son is admonished to seek wisdom, to seek understanding, to seek knowledge. And then they'll know the fear of the Lord, the idea of knowing that respect, that awe, that reverence that should be there. And it's repeated. It's going to be repeated throughout the book of Proverbs. Again, it's like a refrain going through there for that. Wisdom is seen as a gift from God, and it will lead to success in life. That's one of the goals of wisdom. And the parents will speak of positive things for the good of their children, of the benefits that are there, and warn of the dangers. And again, the consequences and the risks of not following what those commands and counsels are. So the consequences that are good, when you follow the commandments and the advice and the counsels, and the risks you are taking when you don't follow them. Chapter 3 of the book speaks about the rewards of wisdom. In verse 9 and 10, honor the Lord with your wealth, with first fruits of all your produce. Then will your barns be filled with plenty. With new wine your vats will overflow. Again, a material prosperity is considered one of the rewards of having wisdom. And we need to shift gears a little bit here too. I go into this in the previous lecture a little bit more. So if you haven't heard that, or if you are wondering about that, you can find out more there. Wisdom brings peace and prosperity. It brings the esteem of others. It brings favor in God's eyes. And again in verse 7 of chapter 3, there it is again, the fear of the Lord, our refrain for that. And knowledge is something that we have to work at. And it's not just for your own personal profit, your own personal gain. It is for the Lord. And it is also for the sake of others as well. There is very much the idea of charity towards neighbor for that. Okay, now, so to use the wealth for the good of others. For instance, in chapter 3, to go over to verse 27. It's interesting here. The idea of using your wealth for the good of others. And there's an obligation to do this. We find in verse 27, do not withhold any goods from the owner when it is your power to act. Say not to your neighbor, go, come back tomorrow and I will give it to you, when all the while you have it. It's the idea of justice towards your neighbor. But it's interesting how close this story is to one Jesus told in the gospel about the neighbor who comes at night, who has a visitor, and goes and asks for something. And by his persistence, he finally gets what he wants for the visitor so that he can be able to feed him. But it's very similar to this. Say not to your neighbor, go, come back tomorrow and I will give it to you, when all the while you have it. Now, it's interesting because Jesus knew of these stories, and he used them. And as you go through the Gospels, after you've gone through Proverbs and some of the other wisdom literature, some things should ring a bell, in a sense, that Jesus knew these stories, but he would adopt them in his own way, for his own purposes, and he would often expand them as well at certain times and move them further along. But we have echoes of his story here, in a sense, or his story is an echo of what's in the book of Proverbs here for this. Chapter 4, we come back to the idea of wisdom personified, even though she herself is not speaking. Again, it's the father's instruction to his children. He's telling them to get wisdom and reminds that this wisdom comes from God. Very clear and concrete images are used. And that's done as a teaching device, if you will. It's good pedagogy. It makes very clear the difference between good and evil. Now, they knew that we're a mixture, the wheat and the chaff, as Jesus speaks about it, that we are a mixture of good and evil. The images that are given in Proverbs are very clear-cut for the sake of example, so that they are given in no uncertain terms in order to make the point. So as you go through, you're going to see that, and keep that in mind, that it's a pedagogical method, if you will, to make it very clear in the teaching. And they realized that things were not always so clear-cut, but for the sake of example, they do it. In chapter 5, again, something somewhat unusual. The other side, if you will, gets to speak. And so, in verse 12 of chapter 5, and you say, "Oh, why did I hate instruction, and my heart spurn reproof? Why did I not listen to the voice of my teachers, incline my ear to my instructors?" Why, indeed, the other side gets to say something. In chapter 6, we have some good examples of wisdom techniques, the open-ended comparison. In chapter 6, starting with verse 6, we read, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, study her ways and learn wisdom." Remember that wisdom is even in animals, so like an animal instinct. They thought of wisdom as being in many, many different things. An artisan, a craftsman has wisdom because he or she knows how to do something, how to make something. Animals have wisdom in the sense of animal instinct. They know how to provide for themselves, how to survive. That was their understanding of it. All this came from God. It was all part of his order. Remember, everything has an order. There's an order in creation. There's an order in society. There's an order in an individual and such for that. So look to the ant and learn wisdom from the ant. For though she has no chief, no commander or ruler, she procures her food in the summer, stores up her provisions in the harvest. How long, O sluggard, will you lie there? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest. Then poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like a brigand. Okay, the comparison to an ant of all things. So look at the ant. Comparison with a slothful, lazy person. It's almost said explicitly, so there's not really much room left for doubt. But it lets you make your own conclusions. It doesn't draw it out in every particular final nuance for that. And we've got another example. Here's one of the first ones I'll take of the X plus 1. Okay, for that. Let's go. We're in this same chapter here. And we'll go down to verse 16. We have 6 things plus one more, 7 things. Now, again, this is a pedagogical device. It is something that will help one to remember, especially remember that these stories are told orally. So it's a memory device. You got to have 6 things plus one more. And usually, but not always, the last thing is the most important. But that's not always true. And as a matter of fact, we're going to see that in this chapter. So let me move my text up here and find it. And we're going to take a little closer look at it for this. Okay, so we want to take a look at verse 16. Just pardon me for a minute here. Okay, in chapter 6, verse 16. There are 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to him. So 6 plus 1, 7. Some other cultures use something kind of similar. I have some Irish friends who will use the saying, "I'll tell you 2 things and it won't be 3." In the sense of, listen to what I got to say from the first 2. That's, again, it's just a device to use. But here we have 6 and then 7. Now what are they? Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that plots wicked schemes, feet that are quick to run to evil, the false witness who utters lies, and the one who sows discord among kindred. Now, the last one there is not necessarily the worst. The hands that shed innocent blood would be the worst. But all of these are evils. And it's the idea, again, of a list of them plus one more to emphasize them, really all of them. But the worst, it would seem, would be the shedding of innocent blood, and it's in the middle, and not the one extra one. But, again, there's discussion here. How would you rank all 7 of them, for instance? And how are they related one to the other? And do certain things, like haughty eyes and a lying tongue, and a heart that plots wicked things, feet that run to evil, a false witness that others lies and everything, will that lead to the shedding of innocent blood for that? In verse 20, we have, observe, my son, your father's command. There it is again. And do not reject your mother's teaching. So both parents are involved in this. Keep them fastened over your heart always. Tie them around your neck. So keep them with you always with this. And it won't be easy. But yet still, you have to keep it before you in a sense. So keep it with you. Put it on like clothing almost. Keep them fastened over your heart and tie them around your neck, so that when you lie down, they will watch over you. When you wake, they will share your concerns. So wisdom shares your concerns. It's interesting. Has a certain feeling over this. These are not just dry kinds of things, but they really involve the person for that. And so the counsel and the consequences. Now, another example of the counseling and the consequences is in verses 24 to 35. I'm not going to read all of that, but it's a warning against adultery. Now, the commandment, of course, is the 6th commandment. Thou shalt not commit adultery. But the author of Proverbs, given that, has no discussion about that commandment, rather gives reasons not to commit adultery, the consequences, the shame, the disgrace, and what it will cost one, the wrath and the vengeance of the woman's husband, who will beat you severely if you do it. It's an interesting comparison, too, that the writer makes to a thief who steals in order to survive. Has still done something wrong, but they had an excuse, a mitigating circumstance. But for the adulterer, there is none. And so the practical consequences, it just isn't worth it. Think for a moment. Count the cost. Besides the fact that it is against the commandments, it's not a smart thing to do. It will cost you severely, and there is no reason for it. A thief may have to steal in order to feed his family. There is a mitigating circumstance. There's no such thing in adultery. So again, the counsel and the command together. Chapter 7 continues on with the instruction against adultery. And it gives a description of a person being seduced by a married woman. And it's very, very graphic in a way. In verses 22 and 23, the writer uses a like comparison. Something is like something. What's it like? She traps him like one would trap an animal. Slaughter an ox. Kill a deer. Snatch a bird. A rather graphic kind of comparison for it. Again, to drive home the point. Don't do it for this. Chapter 8, then we move on and see wisdom personified, speaking directly to us and to all for this. And again, the connection of material wealth and wisdom. There's a detailed comparison of that. Remember, for the writer, wisdom writers in general, and for the writer of Proverbs, material wealth is a gift from God. And it's also the result of wisdom. They go together. A person who is wise should be able to amass a certain amount of wealth. Again, in moderation, enough for themselves and for their family to support themselves, have a little bit more so that they can be generous to others. But it's not an end in itself. And if someone has wisdom, they should be able then to obtain this wealth. And if somebody has wealth and it's not ill-gotten gain, they probably have wisdom that they were able to get it. So one reinforces the other in that sense. So wealth should be for the good of the person who has it, with a clear notion of their responsibility to others. And wisdom is far better than any amount of wealth for that. Okay, so moving on here, let me move up on my text to chapter 8 for some other examples of things. Let's go down to verse 14, chapter 8, verse 14. Mine are counsel and advice. Mine is strength. I am understanding. That's what wisdom is doing. It's advising, based upon the law, the commandments, and flowing from them, and giving you examples, and also explaining why. What are the consequences for this? It flows from the law, picks up where the law doesn't have a specific command. There isn't a law for everything. Those who are naive will gain understanding, and those who are intelligent will get even more intelligence for this. Now in verse 15 then of chapter 8, by me, this is wisdom again speaking, by me kings reign, and rulers enact justice. So the wise ruler is one who does justice for others. And I mentioned in the last talk the interrelationship amongst the narrative, the law, the prophets, and wisdom around the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And this will come up again in the book of Proverbs. The idea that it was the king's responsibility to take care of the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And it came out of, that responsibility came out of an idea of that the poor, the widow, and the orphan were especially the concern of God himself, because they had no one else to turn to, no other resources. They only could rely on God, and so they did. And so God very much was concerned about them. And so others should be as well. So you will find examples going through Proverbs where the advice is given to take care of the poor, the widow, and the orphan with that. And especially where this is going to be used for someone who is going to become a ruler of the people. So his father, the king, is reminding him of his obligation. It's not something that he can just pass off or do if he wants to or that. He has a serious obligation. And so wisdom is needed by those who are going to be just and wise rulers for this. So to remember the poor, the widow, and the orphan, and his responsibility when he becomes the ruler for it. In these verses. So the prince is, in a sense, learning what he's going to need to know when the time comes for him to take over from his father. In verse 22, wisdom tells us something about herself. She is begotten by God. Remember, in the Old Testament, wisdom is never deified. Wisdom is always a creature of God, very close to God, sometimes identified with his thoughts or his plan. But here we've got to be careful, because for ourselves, with the knowledge we have of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, our tendency is to jump very quickly to an understanding of the Trinity and Jesus as the Word and the wisdom of God. They are nowhere near that point in the Old Testament, centuries before Christ. And so wisdom is always a creature, never deified. Very close to God, is there at the creation, is sort of like his plan, his wisdom, his thought or something even, something like that. Wisdom is personified, gets to speak, gets to do things, but don't make the jump to the idea of the Trinity or Jesus as the wisdom of God. Okay, when we do that, we've moved into the fuller sense of Scripture, which is the sense that's known with the benefit of later revelation. the revelation of Christ himself. In the literal sense, which is the sense of the original author, the human author, and his community that he's writing for, that would not be the point, that it is the Trinity or about Jesus as wisdom of God. We see that with the hindsight of revelation for that. So keep that in mind. So wisdom is a distinct creature in the minds of the writers of the wisdom literature. It's created first, but is created, not deified. Now, we've got here this, to look at it. In verse 22, the Lord begot me, the beginning of his works. Okay, the New American says begot. The Hebrew that's underneath that is actually the sense of having had in hand, acquired, or possessed. So the Lord had me, in a sense, created me, had me in hand, or acquired me in a sense of his plan. He had a plan in mind. And that's identified with wisdom. But it's separate. It fits the idea of God as creator, fashioning, making something in the world like a craftsman, having a blueprint, following his own plan or his idea, having it in hand or at hand in his mind of all he wants to do when he creates the world. He's got the plan first. It doesn't come out of chaos, and it doesn't just sort of happen as it goes along. He's not making it up as it goes along. God knows what he wants to do from all eternity before the world is created. And that's the understanding that they had. Now, how to express that, okay, in words that they could understand and that their first hearers, their first audience, their first community could understand. So that's what's happening there. So wisdom is right there with God, playing and delighting in it all, interestingly enough. It's a good image for meditation with that, and God's plan for the world. Chapter 9 uses the image of a house and a great banquet being prepared there, and one comes and dines on morsels of wisdom. It's a good image for this. Also, too, it's interesting that the writer says, don't bother with trying to instruct the arrogant or evildoers. It only gets you in trouble. Rather, if you try to instruct the wise and to correct them, then it helps both of you. And that's seen in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 9. Let's see here what we have. Instruct the wise, and they will become wiser. Teach the just, and they will advance in learning. But in the previous, verse 8, do not reprove the arrogant, lest they hate you. Reprove the wise, and they will love you. So don't waste your time. It's kind of an interesting thing to look at, but it's reality sometimes for that. In verse 10 again, we've got our refrain. Once more, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Again, beyond just facts, but how do they fit together? How do we find our place before God and our place in this world? Verses 11 and 12, just staying again in chapter 9, give some of the rewards. For by me your days will be multiplied, and the years of your life increased. One of the rewards of wisdom was a long life. Now, they knew that some people died young. Didn't mean that they were evil or that. That was the reality of the situation. But life itself was a gift from God. And so those who lived a long and fruitful life were in a special way gifted by God, because life came from God. He was giving you life, an abundance of life, a successful, a prosperous life. That's how they saw it. It might not seem so familiar to us, but you think about it. There's a lot there that you could meditate upon. So, if you are wise, wisdom is to your advantage. And the other side of that, if you are arrogant, you alone shall bear it. For that. So again, the contrast there, the rewards, and what happens if you don't consider the consequences, and if you don't try to seek wisdom for that. In verse 13 now, we have woman folly, as the New American translates it. There's a contrast here between lady wisdom and woman folly or dame folly. Sometimes you'll find in the translations, lady wisdom, dame folly. The New American uses woman folly in their translation. Again, it's a comparison in contrast for this. Woman folly is raucous, utterly foolish. She knows nothing. Again, the very clear categories for the teaching of that. And it continues on, as you can read through there for that. And it's in very clear language, very strong language. Then we have chapter 10, and this starts another collection, Proverbs of Solomon. Well, we found that already at the beginning about Solomon. But here's another, a second collection. Again, some from him, others coming in from elsewhere, in honor of him, in memory of him, in his style or such. What this will do, too, in putting it all together in here and attributing it to Solomon, it gives a certain weight, a certain gravitas, if you will, to all of these, wherever they came from. It gives an authority, the ring of authority, as if they all came from Solomon, who again was known for both his wisdom and his wealth. There's no deception in this. It's all done in the spirit of Solomon or in some way connected to honor him. He is the patron of wisdom in that way, then you could look at it. And there's a shift that happens now with this collection. It's still an instruction for a child, usually for the son, could be for the daughter as well. But now it'll change to the third person. And it's a list of sayings for this. So grammatically, it just shifts a little bit. Now, you could take any one of these and make a banner or a poster out of them. Or you could take one, put it on a calendar for each day of the week, some of these sayings. So they're more general in that sense, in saying that they're in the third person. So are some of the others previous or that. But I don't want to say actually that they're impersonal, because you are to apply them to yourself for that. But they are more just a list of sayings. You could take any one of them and make them your own. Many of them are open-ended. You need to apply them yourself and draw your own conclusions. They're basically observations on life. They're simple, yet they contain much wisdom. And some of them have an edge to them. The wise and the fool are compared with those clear distinctions. These are sayings that are universal, communal, individual, and all cultures had them. We have them in our own history. For instance, think of Poor Richard's Almanac. These things are universal in that sense. They apply to everybody, and they also apply to each one of us individually. So, again, they're universal, communal, and individual for that. So, continuing on, looking through just a few examples. We're in chapter 10, the second collection of them. In verse 13, on the lips of the intelligent is found wisdom, but a rod for the back of the one without sense. Now this will come again a few times, and we've got to be careful here again too. We've got outside of the Bible, we have the old saying, spare the rod and spoil the child. And we would not agree with that today. But you will find some of this. And so the idea of a rod for the back of the one without sense, to beat somebody, certainly not a child, not even an adult. But consider the context of the times. And so again, give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here for that. We have a greater sensitivity, and rightly so. Be careful with it, and just take it for what it is, and see that it's in there and how it came about and what they have, and that the Bible has its violent sections and all parts, especially in the narrative and in the prophets as well. Not as much in wisdom, but it does come up, and so here is one of them for it. Verse 26 is interesting. As vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes are sluggards to those who send them. Interesting comparison there. Chapter 11, a series of contrasts between good and evil. Again, very clear for the sake of instruction. So in chapter 11, let's take a look at verse 10. Verse 10 we need to do a little explanation of. We're in chapter 11, in verse 10. When the just prosper, the city rejoices. Okay, no problem with that. That makes sense. When the wicked perish, there is jubilation. Ooh, what's going on there? We can see that when the just prosper, the city rejoices. Fine, no problem with that. When the wicked perish, there's jubilation? Rejoice in the misfortune of others? It's not really vengeance. Something else is going on here. It's rather the human reaction of relief that evil is gone. Okay, it's been purged from their midst. When the wicked perish, there is jubilation in the sense that there's relief from evil. And there's also, though, too, a little bit of an edge here, a sense of satisfaction that justice has been done. Things are back in the right order. Someone has gotten their comeuppance, we would say, for instance. And so things are right. There's a certain justice in that sense. And again, we've got to be careful with this. It strikes us as being unchristian. We consider the context for it. Things are back in right order, and order is very important for wisdom. So some of these things will startle you, and that's okay. Think about them a little bit. They're not just platitudes. They're meant to make you think. Now, verse 22, another one we've got to be careful with. Like a golden ring in a swine's snout is a beautiful woman without judgment. You're going to find that especially two groups are singled out within Proverbs. Foreign women, adulterous women, women who are seductresses for that. Now, it goes both ways, all right? But you're going to find more often in the examples, let's be honest, of the woman for that. Now, the problem, there's the background, the context of one of the foreign women, they were a temptation to lose the faith. They came from paganism, and they could draw away someone from the faith, and a whole family or that. So there was always a fear about marrying foreign women. Ezra and Nehemiah are very, very strong on this, and it causes problems because they go overboard in some ways. But they are in a situation where they're coming back from the exile and they're fighting for their survival to keep the faith going. And so they get very, very strong in their precepts against this. But we find a little bit of it in Proverbs as well. So that's the context there against foreign women. And the idea of the temptation that there is for adultery and that, we've seen that already. I've talked about that. It's there. It is perhaps more so than we would want to see. And again, they knew that, again, it worked both ways. And there, any kind of adultery, it's got to take two parties and such. But one won't be mentioned as much. Just bear with it. I don't make excuses for it. It's there, or don't deny it, but keep in mind the situation as it is for that. And you're going to come across it, and you're going to have to deal with it. And that's the way it is. It's part of Scripture. And it has a human author, and the human author's limitations come out for that. Okay. God works in mysterious ways. In verse 24, we have, one person is lavish, yet grows still richer. Another is too sparing, and yet is the poorer. What's that all about? Okay, the idea of what the New American translates from the Hebrew as lavish is in the sense of generous. generous. One who gives. The actual word that's translated as lavish is one who scatters, and the idea of spreading freely his property or giving charity widely. Think of like a sower sowing the seed far and wide. One who is lavish in the sense of gives away things not without thought or wantonly, but freely, generously with that. And the one who is sparing of that and grows poor, the idea there of sparing is someone who's stingy. Okay, so the person who is generous grows still richer, and one who is stingy is all the poorer. And life is like that. There's a certain amount of justice, I suppose you could say, between the two, the clear contrast there. And so the idea of making your own conclusions from that. In chapter 12, there are many that are open-ended, simply a statement, and it's left to the reader to ponder and make the application. So not all of them are so obvious. You may disagree with some of them, but that's the idea, to make you think. They're sometimes clear-cut. Chapter 12, verse 1, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, and whoever hates reproof is stupid. Can't be clearer than that. Verse 14, from the fruit of their mouths people have their fill of good, and the works of their hands come back upon them. Verse 16, fools immediately show their anger, but the shrewd conceal contempt. What do you think about that? They conceal contempt. Not just that they let it go or just don't do anything or, just keep their thoughts to themselves. But the contempt, the shrewd person conceals their contempt. The fool shows their anger immediately. That goes back to the idea of wisdom, where the one who is in control, the silent one, is the ideal to be looked toward, rather than the hot one. That comes out of Egyptian wisdom literature, the Egyptian culture, where they talked about the silent one who had all their emotions and such in control and had self-control and self-discipline, and the wild one was the fool that just let their emotions run all over the place and got them in trouble. That was the Egyptian understanding of that. So it's somewhat a little bit like that, but it's something to think about. Fools immediately show their anger, but the shrewd conceal contempt. The babble of some people, in verse 18, is like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise is healing. Verse 22, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who are truthful, his delight. Verse 28, in the path of justice is life, but the way of abomination leads to death. In chapter 14, the image of a house, which we saw earlier as well for this. Now, verse 4 needs a little bit of explanation. We're in chapter 14. Let's see what we have in verse 4. Where there are no oxen, the crib is clean, but abundant crops come through the strength of the bull. What is that all about? What's the comparison there? Okay. Where there are no oxen, the crib is clean, but abundant crops come through the strength of the bull. All right. What's in there is a great bit of artistry, because there is a little bit of a play on words in the Hebrew. Now, of course, the translation is going to lose it, but it will. It'll stick with you in a sense, and I will go through that. But we've gone for just almost an hour or so for this, or even a little bit over. I'm not really actually timing it, but I know it's getting close to that. So I'm going to stop part 1 here, and I'm going to pick up this particular verse in our next time and continue on with the rest of the book of Proverbs.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.